To be or not to be? That is the question.
At a moment of crisis. This is the second speech in the play where Hamlet directly contemplates suicide. But it is radically different to the "oh that this too solid flesh would melt" speech that precedes it in Act 1, Scene 2. There Hamlet was overcome with emotion. He seemed so upset by the events of the preceding weeks, by his father's death, his uncle's ascension to the throne, his mother's incestuous marriage, that he expressed a passionate loathing towards himself and his own body, hoping that it would dissolve and melt away. This speech, the famous "to be or not to be" speech, also contemplates suicide, but from a very different perspective. Here Hamlet's tone is measured and philosophical. It's not an emotional outburst. It is a calm and thoughtful reflection upon the question of suicide. Is it, Hamlet asks in the opening line, better to exist or to not exist? The abstract, philosophical tone of the speech is immediately established by the use of the grammatical infinitive, a particular verb form that exists in many languages, signified in English by the word to. As in phrases like "to live is to die," the infinitive is used to talk about abstract concepts, to talk about things in general rather than a specific example of something, to walk as opposed to walking. At the same time, Hamlet's word choices imply that this question, whether we should live or die, is the fundamental question for humanity, more important than any other question. He uses the word be, rather than say exist or live, which is a special verb called the copula that exists in every language, which expresses the basic fact of existence or of identity between two concepts. Thus, Hamlet's use of this most basic and important verb in the English language, rather than alternatives like exist or live, shows that the question of suicide is, in Hamlet's mind, the most basic and important of all questions. Now Hamlet asks which of the two alternatives is, in his words, nobler.
Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them.
Thinking about the question of suicide, Hamlet tells us that both options, to continue one's life or to end it, could be considered brave. On the one hand, continuing to live is brave, since it means continuing to endure all the terrible things that happen in this world, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, as they are metaphorically described. On the other hand, committing suicide could also be construed as brave, since it requires taking deliberate action to end one's life, to take up arms against a sea of troubles, rather than passively continuing to live. However, the so-called bravery of committing suicide is immediately called into question, as Hamlet goes on to describe death in such positive terms that it seems like an easy way out.
To die, to sleep no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished.
Death, which Hamlet euphemistically refers to as sleep, is described as something which will end all the suffering, the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to, which simply means universal for all human beings. It is, he says, a consummation or a state of being devoutly to be wished. The use of the religious term devoutly is laden with irony, since suicide on religious terms is unambiguously a sin and should not be wished for. Equally important is this constant repetition of the infinitive construction we have described earlier, to die, to sleep, which continues to emphasize the thoughtful, abstract tone of the speech, despite its dark subject matter. Now, however, we hear from Hamlet a fear that death might not be the beautiful, peaceful sleep which he hopes for.
To die, to sleep, to sleep. Perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, What dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life.
Continuing with this metaphor of death as sleep, Hamlet wonders whether in that sleep we might have dreams, perchance to dream, as he says, which is a metaphorical way of asking whether there is an afterlife. After we have shuffled off this mortal coil, which is a metaphor for death, there is the fear that something awful may happen to us, specifically the threat of divine punishment as a result of ending one's own life. Two idioms need explaining here. First, give pause simply means to make you reconsider or doubt something, here in the sense that the fear of divine punishment may make one reconsider whether suicide is such a good idea. Second, there's the respect, is simply an idiosyncratic form of in that respect, or in modern English, for that reason. These are the reasons, Hamlet thinks, that discourage suicide. Nevertheless, Hamlet goes on to say, there are reasons why it might be very difficult to resist, whatever our fears might be for the afterlife.
For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delays, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin.
Suicide is, Hamlet recognizes, a very quick way out, whatever fears we might have about the punishment that could await us beyond the grave. Here Hamlet lists some of the terrible things that can happen in life, generalized under the heading the whips and scorns of time. There is the oppressor's wrong, meaning the injustices committed by those who oppress us in society. The proud man's contumely, meaning the insults of someone who is proud. The pangs of deprised love, meaning the pain of loving someone who doesn't love you back. The law's delay, meaning the universal fact that criminals aren't always brought to justice, wrongs not always righted, at least not without significant delay. The insolence of office, meaning the terrible way people with power or authority can treat those who don't. Finally, the fact that people who do good are often spurned or insulted. Given this, why should we remain alive when we can so easily our quietus make with a bare bodkin, meaning an unsheathed dagger? Quietus is an old word that simply means to die. Given this, Hamlet concludes on a very pessimistic note that the only reason any of us continue to persist in this miserable life is because we fear divine punishment.
Who would fardels bear, to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of.
Why would anyone, he says, grunt and sweat under a weary life, were it not for the fear that something else worse awaits us afterwards, something from that undiscovered country, meaning the afterlife, from whose bourne, meaning place, no traveller returns? Whether Shakespeare noticed the irony of the fact that the play has featured a ghost, a traveller who has indeed returned from the undiscovered country, is unclear. But it puzzles the will, Hamlet says, that anyone stays. The only explanation can be our fear of the unknown. We are led, he says, to continue to bear those ills we have, rather than fly, meaning flee from, the ones we don't yet know about. Better the devil you know, as the old saying goes, than one you don't. Then we get the most famous and most quotable line from the speech, apart from the opening line, which summarizes Hamlet's central idea.
Thus conscience doth make cowards of us all.
Conscience, here meaning the religious feelings we have, specifically our respect for the Christian viewpoint that suicide is immoral, ironically makes us into cowards, because we make the decision to avoid suicide not because it is inherently right, but because we fear the unknown consequences it could lead to. Now Hamlet concludes the speech with a more wordy restatement of the same idea.
And thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought. And enterprises of great pith and moment, with this regard their currents turn awry, and lose the name of action.
The native hue of resolution, meaning the basic courage which Hamlet thinks is inherent to all people, presumably before religion or society have affected our moral worldview, is sicklied o'er or destroyed by the pale or cowardly thought, which is the fear of the unknown or of divine punishment. Consequently, even an enterprise of great pith and monument, meaning an act of great bravery, which is an ironic way of describing suicide, is defeated, and ultimately we avoid it, even though we often wonder if it might be better. The abstract tone of this speech can make it seem callous and disturbing, since there is a dissonance between the dark subject matter and the relatively abstract and emotionless language with which he describes it. Equally disturbing and thought-provoking is the place where Hamlet ends. Really, Hamlet seems to think, there is no reason to avoid suicide, and the only reason he hasn't is because he's afraid of the afterlife. How serious Hamlet is about this is unclear. As the poet T.S. Eliot once said, Hamlet's madness, which is ostensibly a ploy so no one will suspect him of plotting to murder his father-in-law, seems somehow less than madness, but also more than feigned. How much is this speech, and the contradictory ideas it raises but never resolves, an expression of his fake madness or his tenuous sanity? Is it meant to be a serious expression of what Hamlet thinks, or is it an emanation of his madness, perhaps pretend, perhaps genuine, perhaps somewhere in between? As Polonius says after overhearing him, it may be madness, but there's method in it.